Holy City Center Radio's episode 132, and I am your host, Christian Sanger. Today is Wednesday, June 7th, 2023. Midway through the week already, motoring through this first week of June. I hope things have been going well for you. It's been a little toasty, the last couple days. Not too shabby out there, though. Can't complain too much. Been pretty quiet around here, not much to share. So we're just going to get right into it. We've got some stories to talk about, so we are not going to waste any more time. South Carolina Supreme Court says it will hear arguments on the state's newest abortion ban law and what has been a crazy swirling of events that is very similar to what happened just a few months before. We've talked about this here on the podcast. You may remember this whole thing. I'm not going to recap the entirety of it, but what you need to know now is that the order came down on Tuesday with the state's 5 justices scheduling oral arguments on the 6-week abortion ban for 9:30 a.m. on June 27th. This order came nearly 6 months after the court deemed a very similar abortion ban was unconstitutional. Big difference this time, of course, though, is that this new bill will face an all-male Supreme Court, which was not the case last time. Just for a quick recap, back on May 25th, Governor Henry McMaster signed the extremely restrictive abortion ban into law. However, right after, groups like Planned Parenthood and other women's health groups filed a lawsuit immediately after. Judge Clifton Newman of the Murdaugh murders trial fame ordered a freeze on the law following a hearing less than 24 hours later. Governor McMaster immediately asked for the Supreme Court to override Judge Newman's decision. However, in Tuesday's statement, the court denied that motion. So it'll be, as I said, because they denied to override it, which didn't really make much sense for them to do. The hearing and oral arguments will begin at 9:30 a.m. on June 27th. So we'll, who knows how long that will run, but it is possible that shortly thereafter we will have a decision for the Supreme Court. As I mentioned, a very similar bill was ruled unconstitutional by the previous iteration of the court. That then led to another lawsuit and has gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, but there's been no updates on it. It'll be interesting to see what this new all-male court rules, if they find, the same thing the last court did, which is that this is unconstitutional, which they probably should, because there's not much that is different in this legislation that would make any difference. But again, when you have a new court, that means different opinions, different ways to look at things, and you just never know what's going to happen. Of course, I will keep you updated on any changes in this story. So while our legislators spent most of this session going, and don't get me wrong, there was some decent things that were passed, and it's not that they can't argue multiple things at one time. They frequently do that. There's many bills being worked through committees, and there's hearings, and it's always happening. But it was pretty clear their big focus was a lot of these culture war things, a lot of talk about what can and can't be taught in schools, a lot of talk about care for transgender people, specifically children. There's a lot of talk about abortion, of course. And, some things end up getting left by the wayside, such as like hate crime legislation, that this state is one of only 2 in the country that doesn't have any. And other important things. There's not a whole lot of talk about what schools really need, just a lot of culture war, banning books. We don't want to talk about LGBTQ people in history, or talk about any kind of sexuality in school that isn't your, cisgender, heteronormative, topics. And so one of the things that kind of got left by the wayside is the state budget, which is pretty important. Well, because they were too busy with this, abortion ban in this extended session they had, the first public meeting in 18 days was held this week of a conference committee that's been trying to work out a budget deal between the South Carolina House and the Senate. However, they have showed no signs of getting closer to a deal. And we're talking about the state's $13 billion spending plan that is supposed to start on July 1st. So we are less than a month away, which, all right, there's still some time, you would think, but they don't seem to be very close on this issue at all. The 2 main budget lawmakers in each chamber insisted they weren't at an impasse, though. This happened at Monday's meeting, but that meeting only lasted like about 2 minutes. And I'm not being hyperbolic there. That it really lasted less than 3 minutes. So I don't know how much could really be accomplished in that setting. And it seems that there's obviously something holding up any talks regarding the state budget. Now, what happens if the budget isn't passed? It's, not as catastrophic as we've heard about, with the national, we're talking about the debt ceiling and, that whole thing that was just going on the federal level, but it's still not a great thing to have happen, of course. So, if the budget isn't passed before then, things like raises for state employees, which lawmakers actually finally agreed on, they were going to spend, there was like an extra $1 billion in the state budget that they weren't planning on. They already agreed that that money could be used to give raises to state employees. Well, if the budget isn't passed, they can't start those raises. Now, the House and the Senate have given themselves a little bit of wiggle room. What are they doing here? Are they playing chicken? Are they trying to see which side will cave first? I mean, who knows? But they did agree last month to a resolution allowing the government to keep spending money at its current levels if the budget isn't finalized before the fiscal year ends. So, again, not catastrophic like we were talking about, again, on the federal level, but and it's great that they were able to come to an agreement like, hey, we'll just keep the budget rolling as is until we do get an agreement. So that's great. And I mean, that if you're going to possibly not get a deal done in time, at least things will continue on as they have budget wise. Now, if the two sides can't reach an agreement before the end of the month, as I mentioned, that more than $1 billion in extra revenue that the state collected this budget year couldn't just be spent on those raises. There's all sorts of different things that would affect as well. It's also been set aside, or they're hoping to set it aside for things like building rural schools. And there's also hundreds of millions of dollars that has been, kind of earmarked for local project like downtown revitalizations, festivals, park improvements. So that's, again, it might be like, what's a little bit of a delay? And yeah, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge deal depending on how long the delay is, but it would still be frustrating, especially those waiting for raises that they're not going to get them until the budget passes. And also some projects and things might be on hold until they can get that done, depending on how long it drags out, how long these projects get delayed. Who knows what that can mean on the back end, further delays, further issues. So, of course, they want to, and we as a community want this budget to be done. And it's frustrating that they focus so much time on a lot of these things in our legislature instead of doing this, or maybe put this on the back burner, didn't dedicate as much time to this as they could have and probably should have. While they're trying to pass an abortion ban that was already ruled unconstitutional, it could have been spent working on this or something else. So, yeah, it's frustrating, not surprising. We see how our General Assembly in the state works, and I use that term very, very loosely. So, hopefully, it won't get dragged on too much longer. So, the money that people are expecting, whether it's raises or for different projects for the good of the state, is not delayed for much longer. SC for Ed, one was a group you may have heard of, especially over the last couple election cycles. They were a pretty well known and strong political force in terms of what they were advocating for, which is for teachers here in this state. Well, despite seemingly being this very strong organization that had a lot of pull, they announced on June 5th that they are taking an indefinite pause in their operations. This grassroots organization was founded back in May of 2018 by a Blythewood high school teacher, and she created it as a Facebook discussion group at first. And then from there, it became an actual group where they campaigned for pay raises, better working conditions, and teacher representation in education policymaking. When it was at its strongest, like I said, it was the election years or leading up to one. So 2019 and 2020, they were very big. At that time, the group counted hundreds of organizers within their umbrella. They were doing protests, going to state house offices and committee hearings, and at one point turned out an estimated 10,000 teachers and supporters in a state house rally, which is one of the largest in recent memory, according to an article in the Post and Courier. However, despite all this, leaders of the group, who do admit that their influence is kind of gone down since the pandemic, and its founder, Lisa Ellis, for that matter, had a defeat in the 2022 state superintendent of education race, may have led to them of deciding we need to end this. For her part, Ellis said that there's only so many times you can beat your head against a brick wall and expect change to happen. We're burned out and tired, and you've got to step back and say, this is not in the best interest of me and my health. So, certainly a personal decision for Ellis as well. Since this is not like an official organization in the sense that they have a full staff and everything, it's a lot of volunteers. And she was a big part of that. So, why did their kind of influence start to go down? Some critics told the Post and Courier it was the group's, pressure tactics that they used, especially the ones they used on social media, that kind of alienated some possible allies that they could make in the state house. Critics also said they had some uncompromising stances on certain topics that also kind of limited how far the movement can go. Ellis says that the legislature's refusal to even listen to the group necessitated those hardball tactics. Well, regardless of what side you fell on, whether you supported SC for Ed and the things they were trying to do for teachers, or if you were against them for whatever reason, the group, for the moment, is done. Now, it's an indefinite pause, means it could always come back, but at this point, this advocacy group for teachers that at one point, like I said, was very influential, is done. And it's unclear if anyone or any group will kind of take up the mantle to go to bat for teachers when it comes to legislations and things going on in our schools. Speaking of legislation, the effort for affordable housing here in the Low Country may actually get a boost from a bill that the state's General Assembly passed last week. The bill, which was passed at the State House, will allow local governments to use tourism related tax dollars for affordable housing projects. That could provide funding for a large Charleston County affordable housing plan. So if you're wondering, okay, when you say the Low Country, is it going to include this area of Charleston, which I would imagine most of the people listening to this podcast are in the Charleston area or Charleston County. And yes, it could potentially help out that housing plan. So that plan, which was finalized back in March, is called the Housing Our Future Project, and it includes dozens of goals and recommended strategies to try to come up with some affordable housing in Charleston County. Again, anyone listening here is probably well aware that it's not cheap to live in the Charleston area, and some places that used to be a little bit more affordable are getting less so. And for people who are gainfully employed, or maybe even have family with two people working at the same time, it can be difficult for them. So imagine people making minimum wage, people struggling to find work, and etc. And it's even more difficult for them, of course, especially in places like downtown Charleston. But again, it's spreading everywhere. So the first two priorities for this plan were to find funding for the Housing Trust Fund and the potential strategy of land banking. Now, a 2% hospitality and accommodations tax already applies when visitors pay their bills at restaurants, bars, and hotels, but that money can now be used for a variety of needs in the area. Now, Charleston County, for their part, says they need an estimated 29,000 to 36,000 new units of housing over the coming decade. So there's certainly a need for housing, period, but also affordable housing. And this is potentially a great way to do it. We see this state and this city in particular on all sorts of different lists and getting coverage and all sorts of different types of press. We see how many people are moving here and have been for many years now, and we're getting more crowded, and housing costs are go skyrocketing. And like I said, anybody who's been here for any length of time can see how dramatically prices have changed when it comes to whether it's buying a house very specifically renting as well is insane. And you hear stories all the time, not just of residents, but businesses as well, not being able to afford leases and rent spaces and things. So clearly, we need some help. And what better way than tourism dollars? So this would be a great use of some of the money we collect from tourists to help out those in our community who need it most to find homes. These are people who live and work here or are trying to work here. And without them, a lot of the times, tourists wouldn't have a lot of the things they want when they come here. And we need to be taking care of our own, of course. So I think this is a great way. And hopefully we will see that some of this money will end up going to affordable housing. Not a done deal yet, but hopefully within the coming weeks and months, once we have everything kind of finalized from the State House, we'll know a little bit more about this. And finally, just real quick, I'm not going to do a deep dive, but I'm sure you've at least heard the term Union Pier. That is a development downtown, in downtown Charleston, that is currently being discussed ad nauseum, it seems, and with good reason, because this is a massive project that they're trying to build on the harbor off of the peninsula. There's been different proposals, different ideas, and so you're hearing a lot about that. But most importantly, the proposed redevelopment of this Union Pier area is having and they've already had several meetings, but there's a meeting tonight, Wednesday, June 7th, when you're listening to this podcast. There's going to be a meeting with the Charleston Planning Commission at 5 p.m. at the Ports Authority Passenger Terminal, which is at the southern tip of the pier site. Now, the commission who is hosting it, they say their job is to listen to the public and consider the pros and cons before making a recommendation to Charleston City Council. Their recommendation is non-binding. The council doesn't have to accept it, but that's the plan. After they listen to the public, think about what everybody has said, they are going to go to City Council and say, this is the plan for Union Pier that we think is best. And then the council, of course, will make that final decision on whether to approve the planned unit development, for the zoning, or any other plans related to the pier. Some other things that you've probably seen discussed. There's been discussions about the height of buildings. As you know, Charleston is not a fan of approving buildings that are above a certain height. There's been a couple proposals where certain parts of it, the buildings incorporated within the plan, were a little bit too high for some people's liking. So, in any event, all of that is to say, tonight at 5 p.m., you can go to this meeting. You can let them know what you think of any plans that you've seen or anything that is discussed at that meeting. I know that's important to a lot of people. And I mean, it should be important to all of us. Don't get me wrong, because this could be a major development, which could either be incredible for the city or could lead to many other problems, specifically as it relates, of course, to flooding. So lots of information out there. I encourage you to look into it. Our local media has done a good job of covering it. It's confusing. I get it. When you're talking about things being built and all the different steps that are involved with it, and when there's different proposals and who to believe and who not to believe, it's certainly confusing. But hopefully, after this meeting, we'll have a little bit more insight into, what this planning commission is thinking would be the best course of action based on their own work and what the public is saying. And we'll get closer to an understanding of what could be going in that space. So again, if you're interested, 5 p.m. tonight at the Ports Authority Passenger Terminal at the southern tip of the pier site. That'll do it for this episode. You'll hear from me again on Friday. I can't wait already to talk to you and see what is going to be in the news and what we'll be discussing. Until then, I want to say thank you to you all for checking out the podcast. Please like, rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. Please do that for this podcast on whatever streaming platform you're listening on. It's a great help to me, and I really appreciate it. You can also help out by going to holycitycenter.com/shop to pick up some merchandise, or going to patreon.com/holycitycenter to sign up for one of those tiers. Thank you to Tyler Boone, whose music you hear in each and every episode of Holy City Center Radio. And also a big thank you to LMC Sound System. Both Lindsay and Cole with that group have done an amazing job of editing my podcasts, and I couldn't and wouldn't, for that matter, be doing it without them. So big thank you to them as well. Have a great rest of your week out there. Stay safe, have fun, and I'll talk to you on Friday. Until then, good night and good luck.